Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and I'm once again joined by Dodger and Pipsqueak, and we're here to review Lovi Awoken. This is a set by Fluffy Deathbringer that actually started as a set the art, which is a project made by another member of the community, Hersey Corsey, which, unlike the general type of set skeleton or project that people do, instead collected a bunch of arts into a single set file that people could use as the basis for their own projects and own mechanics. Fluffy took that, supplemented it with an art search of their own, and built it into a cool, unique world. I'm going to throw it to Pip to talk more about the lore of the set.
So this set takes place in a um, fictional kind of modern-ish setting, in a world that used to have magic but has it for many, many years. And the kind of central plot of the set is that magic has started to return, and with it has a bunch of terrifying monsters and just kind of the destruction of society. There's also someone being worshipped as a false god, which goes terribly for him in the long run.
Cool. Um, we're going to talk about Avenge, who is the false god, and a little bit more in just a second. But before that, I'm going to throw it to Dodger to talk about the mechanics of the set.
Sure, yeah. So all three new mechanics in this set have re at the start of the name. One of them is rediscover, which is basically like explore, but for a specific permanent type. Or it can get non-permanent types as well. Another one is reconstruct, which is kind of a flashback emerge variant where you can cast it from your graveyard for a different cost, but that gets reduced by the converted mana cost of any permanent you sacrifice this way. And then there's reappropriate, which is essentially an action keyword that has you exile two cards either from your graveyard or from your hand, any combination of those two zones, in order to do some kind of effect. So in general, these are all kind of like graveyardish themes because rediscover can fuel your graveyard. Reconstruct lets you cast cards from your graveyard, and then um, the third one, reappropriate, lets you like exile cards from your graveyard as a cost. But I definitely wouldn't call this like just a graveyard set, even though there are graveyard themes.
Cool, yeah, and it makes sense flavorfully that like there is like a focus on the grave because it's a the idea of like returning what was lost in terms of
Yeah,
magic
yeah.
and like the culture and all of that. And it's very much
And I
like
don't know.
there's elements of like post apocalypse in here, which adds to that.
Yeah, like the world kind of gives me like zombie apocalypse vibes, even though it's not necessarily just zombie apocalypse, but like um, it does kind of have that feel to it.
For sure. Okay, and I think with that general rundown, we can go into specific cards for MSEM. And the first of those is the guy who's been showing his ugly mug over here. Avenge False God. 2 white for a planeswalker, has a unique static where once per turn, not just your turn, any turn, you can tap an untapped creature you control to put a loyalty counter on him. His +1 slow flickers a permanent on on its controller's upkeep. -2 is a solid removal spell that takes out any non-land permanent in exchange for giving them a plains token. And the -10 is incredibly powerful, exiling all permanents, like not just a single opponent, but all opponents control. It replaces them with planes, but if your opponent can't cast anything with it, it's pretty much just winning you the game. So where do you guys think that this card, or where has this card seen play before, and where do you think it could potentially see play later?
I think where you want this card is usually going to be in a control deck that has like a couple tokens lying around, or like yeah, generally just that because it is a flexible answer. It's also a pretty decent blink outlet, um, and having your blink effect be able to also like permanently remove stuff is pretty nice. Um, it's worth noting that the ultimate will just lock someone out of casting spells a good portion of the time because there aren't very many decks that are playing white, sadly. Um, yeah, overall, I think solid role player in some decks.
Um, so where I played this card was back when Panya was really stupid and could take turns on extra turns. I used Avenge as a way of going infinite with Panya in a kind of blue-white control shell. One of the things I found is that while playing with Avenge is the flicker is really, really, really slow when you're using it on your own creatures. Um, it's so slow that it kind of may as well not be used as a flicker outlet unless the game has really ground to a halt. Like,
Mm.
I was flickering Wall of Omens, and just having to wait an entire turn cycle before I got to draw a card kind of sucked. One thing that is kind of neat is you can plus him to kind of pseudo protect planeswalkers since they come back on your next upkeep. So if your opponent can't attack him for whatever reason, you can keep down taking another planeswalker, then flickering that planeswalker.
He can also
But I think the
target
main,
himself, right?
yeah,
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 that's weird.
if you need to for some reason, that's an option. Um, I don't know. In general, this card is solidly good, but it's kind of awkward to use. I imagine it's much better in multiplayer formats where you can charge it up way faster. Um, I think if you don't want the -2 or -10, if you just kind of are using it for the plus, you should be playing Will of a Fickle Lord instead. But this card is the fact that it's a flexible answer slash value engine is really sweet.
Yeah, and I think that's just a pretty good evaluation of it overall. Next up, we have Lone Hunter. Do you want to talk about this one, Dodger?
Sure. So Lone Hunter is a white 2 mana 2/1. It has indestructible as long as it has attacked alone this turn. And then whenever you target it with the spell or ability, if that ability costs one or more mana to, if that spell or ability costs one or more mana to use, you can pay an extra one and then draw a card. So having this has a couple different things, both of them sort of well. Being able to turn um, not only your targeted spells, but also your targeted abilities, means that this can be a pretty strong card draw engine in the right deck, which is a little unusual for white. And being able to attack indestructibly means that, like, if you are suiting up with auras and or equipment, like, that is a good ability to have.
Yeah, I think this card's fine. I'm not sold on it because that second ability has like three different hoops. It has to be a spell or ability you control. It had to cost mana, and you have to pay one.
Mhm.
Um, but that still means if you have an equip one equipment, you have kind of 2 mana draw card that you can just keep doing over and over and over again, which isn't bad. I think this card being a 2 drop is really the main thing that I think helps it. Because if this was any mana more, I think it would be too slow for MSEM.
Yeah, it feels like this is the kind of card that you actually do build a deck around, because most most decks are not going to be able to accommodate its kind of like very unique and weird set of abilities. But I could see a shell that perhaps makes this work really well. I just worry that that shell wouldn't work without drawing Lone Hunter.
Yeah, I think you need to place this in an aggressive deck that wants equipments anyway for reason. So that way it can function without drawing Lone Hunter, but if you do, you can just pop off sometimes in terms of like just generating excess card advantage. Yeah, next up we have Runeclad Seeker. I think it was Pip who put this one on the list. So do you want to talk to us about it?
Yeah, so Runeclad Seeker won't show up in many of your searches for 1 mana prowess creatures because it doesn't have prowess. It is something that is strictly better than prowess. Um, so it has prowess, but if the spell is an aura or equipment, it gets permanently bigger. And I think this card's probably a bit underplayed. Like, most of our prowessy decks don't currently play white, but this card is very powerful. And I think a lot of the aggressive aura shells that exist, with things like Dreamsteel Paladin or with Featherfall Ascetic, should definitely consider this, especially post board. It's a really good way to run people down.
Yeah, I think the fact that this also works with equipment is kind of nice, because I think that the equipment deck the equipment deck actually isn't lacking for good 1 drops, I feel like, but this is a pretty powerful one. In that most of the equipment deck's 1 drops aren't that big by themselves, and this one can grow to be pretty big. So, but also just as a 1 mana 1/2 prowess, this card is also quite good, and I don't think that white really has another 1 drop like this for the prowess decks either. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that about encapsulates my feelings on it.
All right. On to blue. So God Watcher is a card that was under immense scrutiny when it was printed and got slightly modified, but honestly still probably should be under immense scrutiny. And the fact that no one's kind of gotten around to breaking it yet is genuinely shocking to me. So for 4 mana, it's a 1/4. ETB, search any player's library for a creature card, exile it, and then they shuffle their library. And when it dies, you immediately get to put the creature onto the battlefield in your control. So if you have a sack outlet, this is a 4 mana bribery, but it can also hit your library. And it turns out that makes bribery a lot more broken. Um, I haven't thought about going full engine with this yet, but the last time we attempted to record this podcast, spoilers, this is not the first time we're doing that. Sorry, not Fluffy. Caillou pointed out that this card's amazing with what lurks beyond, so this is probably going to be in my next Dream Sight build, or not Dream Sight,
Odd light.
Podlight. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that this card it is very interesting because it feels like it should just be good as a card, too. You know, like um, being a conditional bribery is one thing, but the fact that it can also just be a solid blocker for only 4 mana that also threatens to get you a huge creature for free. And the fact that it can search either your own library or your opponent's means that it's also quite flexible. So yeah, I could definitely see this being a podlight tool. I could see it being a control tool. I could see it being a blink target. Although, actually, no, that wouldn't really work. But
It used to work because it used to be on LTB, and that was
ah,
that was something.
yeah,
I think that was changed before it entered the format, though.
yeah. I think that this is another card. I think this is something that is kind of a theme with this set. Is there are a lot of cards that are kind of being slept on. I
Yeah.
think this is one of them.
Yeah, ironically, it'd be called Lovi Awoken, but y'all still sleeping on.
Um, God Watcher is really stupid in EDH. Play it in EDH.
As well, yeah, that is
Yeah,
absolutely insane.
If you want to do really stupid things with God Watcher, you can play large creatures that reanimate creatures on ETB to immediately get the God Watcher back.
yeah. Unfortunately,
Um,
Scion doesn't do it, but like if you get like a
Heart of the Deadwoods does. People should be playing more Heart of the Deadwoods in EDH.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, card is generically good. Uh, the next card's a little bit sketchier, but I put it on this list because of a very specific archetype. So Imperious Pixie, or sorry, Nixie, is 1 blue for 0/3, blue sack it, bounce target creature. I think this is great in butt fighting. I think from what I've seen, the butt fighting decks don't currently play this, but they do play some other assorted like 0/3s and 0/4s with like some which with very minor upside, some which without any real upside. And this card has a very noticeable upside. It's very comparable to uh Sidisi's Faithful
Hmm.
in the old assault formation decks. So yeah, that's just my thought.
Yeah, I also think there's a lot of value to being able to bounce at instant speed too, um, which makes this arguably a lot better than Sidisi's Faithful. It's also it's also kind of self-contained, so like I guess that is probably a point for Sidisi's Faithful, but it's worth noting that like you can play this on turn one, and then like at a later point just bounce something when you want to. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, next one.
Yep. Next up, we have Supply Run, which is 3 and a blue for an instant. Um, draw 2 cards, but it costs 2 less to cast if a creature you controlled attacked this turn and wasn't blocked. So, some really interesting use cases here. We discussed it was similar to Ambitious Dreams, um, but it has a alt cripple cost, so you have to deal damage. Um, being able to like attack and then like use this in response to or like uh, before damage to trigger prowess or to like draw into combat tricks, like all of that makes it surprisingly useful. It's also just like there's cards like people are running like Crossing the Fog, which has a downside of if you lose your attackers, it's just stone cold useless as a top deck, while this isn't.
Notably, this isn't if your opponent didn't remove your creature in your declare attacker step. If they wait until declare blockers to remove your creature for some reason, you can cast this though. Um, sorry, we discussed that. That's actually rules ambiguous because it's worded differently from ninjutsu or other things that care about unblocked creatures. Since it's not checking for unblocked creatures, it's checking for creatures that weren't blocked. So that's
So
different.
I think you can also attack with a creature and then cast this before. Well, the way it's worded makes it seem like you can attack with a creature and then cast this before blockers, but I'm guessing that is not the intention. Um, because that is also like a fairly common use case for this card, like just being able to, and like at that point it might as well just be raid.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think this card's probably a little bit underplayed, but I also feel like most of the decks that'd be interested in playing this right now aren't seeing a lot of play, period. Like, we don't have a lot of blue X aggro decks that are interested in casting like 2 mana draw twos.
Yeah,
That's kind of a tempo-y thing, and we don't have a lot of those style of tempo decks. Like, the type of tempo decks we have right now are very much flash decks that are trying to play all on your opponent's turn and just like maximize counter magic.
yeah, and there's also ambitious dreams, which is kind of this card, but you can cast it off of your opponent fetching. Which is not like ambitious dreams is not strictly better than this, but like I think that there it's close enough that I feel like the fetch situation is more likely than the situation where it's like, oh, I attacked with the 0/4 and I still wanna, I still want to pay two to draw two cards. And there's always value to be had in like potentially going up to 8 copies of a certain effect, but
This is
um,
probably not something you want 8 copies of.
yeah,
But
I would
having
agree.
2 copies of it in a singleton format like EDH or if MSEM Lander ever takes off,
Also
those
agreed. Yeah.
apparently according to Wendy, who was our local head judge, attacked and wasn't blocked is the same as goes unblocked.
Okay. Cool. So you
So
can't just like attack and then cast this before
yeah,
blockers.
you
Okay.
can't cast this before blockers have been declared. Once blockers have been declared, it doesn't matter if your creature's killed or it goes unblocked, you can cast this.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Swarm of the Dispossessed. Um, for 1 blue, this is a 1/1 flying. So just a kind of generic flying at start. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then sacrifice it, counter target spell with CMC uh X exactly, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on this. So this is kind of just a neat card. The fact that it grows via just paying 1 mana into it. 1 mana is a very easy thing to be able to afford
Hmm.
and you can usually fit it in with your sequencing. So if you really have a 2 drop you need to cast, you just don't pay into it. It's not like this is an upkeep cost. It's an optional ability. Um, and the counterspell mode very quickly becomes relevant. And it's something you can just kind of keep in mind. If you're like, okay, well, the only thing I'm scared of my opponent having is their like 2 mana uh I'm not sure what 2 mana hard hoser they could have, but you leave it on 2 counters like an Aether Vial. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think this card's probably a little bit underplayed. Plipster was trying it when he was forcing mono blue tempo, which I think is probably fine. But
Yeah, I think the main thing to consider when you're running this card are Illusory Steed, Lord Rokai. Why are you running this over those? And it's if you really need like the counterspell density, then and you need something that like, and you're fine with giving up a mana each turn for this to just keep growing, then sure. I also I want to try like some sort of counters based tempo deck with this in Veilborn Meddler, but I don't know if we quite have pieces or support for that yet. But I think that would be really cool if it's something that can come together at some point.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think you'd probably have to pair blue with green or some other color that could help support that. Um,
Blue
Maybe
white for
even go
persevere. I'm
multi.
always gonna say it. Persevere.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually the best part of this card is the first ability, or it's the first ability after
it's
flying.
constant growing.
I I just think that like um if you completely ignore the counter ability, this card can put in a lot of work still. Um, Especially given how Pip said like it's not you only have to pay the counter you only have to put a counter on it if it fits into your curve. And if you've put even one counter on this, this is already attacking as a 2/2 flyer that you spent 1 mana for on 2 different turns. This goes very, very well in any deck that is like kind of that's got a huge density of 1 drops because playing this on turn 1 and then pumping it and playing another 1-drop on turn 1 is like a very solid start to the game. I would be I mean, like the fact that you can use it to counter a spell is great. But oftentimes there's a little bit of tension between like wanting to hit for more versus like there not being like you're not sure if once you put it up to 4/4 now it's vulnerable to Pithwilt. So like or actually it would have been vulnerable like that's not a great example, but like the point is like maybe all of a sudden you put it up to 4/4 and now your opponent's like, I can cast my 2-drop that I really wanted to, and now you lose or something like that. You know, so there is a little bit of but at the same time, like just preventing your opponent from even casting those spells in the first place on previous turns is also very, very good.
Yeah, I think like it's basically just like I think you usually just keep it on 2 or 3, which like a 3/3 fly, 2/2 or 3/3 flyer for 1 is, or like I guess technically 3, but overturns is still really good. Yeah. And then you can just like once you like need like that last bit of damage, you can just pump it up once more. Which like I don't like if they have instant speed removal, then like you were going to sack it, that you were going to like sack your Storm of Dispossess to stop it anyways. If they have an instant speed wipe, which I think is literally just Shaldrin's Rage, then you just keep it on 2, and you just
play. I'm basically just very unsure of how good this actually is, and I would need to play with it to find out, I think.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Okay, next up is our first black card. The Afterlife Takes Its Due, and this is a doozy. It's 1 black for a sorcery that's just destroy all creatures, which, you know, would be strictly worse damnation if our format's black control decks weren't already trying to play triple black for villainy cough. And then it gets better because it has Reconstruct for 7, and when you reconstruct it, you make an XX zombie creature token, where X is the number of creatures that died or were put into a graveyard this turn, which usually is just going to be the wipe, but if you have other synergies with it, so much the better. Yeah, it's kind of just like a generically powerful, disgusting card. I think it's like the one like unconditional hard wipe in black. It fills like a lot of roles in the meta, honestly.
Yeah, the other thing, and we got a little bit into this, is Reconstruct does so much for the playability of this card. There's so many different little things that having Reconstruct just printed on this card does, and just kind of gets absurd. Because let's say you have Reconstruct, that means if you ever mill it over or discard it or whatever, it's now just living there rent free in your opponent's mind. Because they know that they can't overextend too much, because if they do, you can just, if you have 7 mana or you have like a 3-drop walker, you can just immediately say, cool, sacrifice this, 4 mana, nuke the board. Like Intrepid, for instance. Really good with Intrepid. And then when you nuke the board, you're also potentially getting a fairly large threat. And it doesn't need to be huge. If it's literally just a 3/3 that comes after your board wipe, that's pretty good. That's very similar to a 3 ETBs and destroys all other creatures. There's just so many little things about this card that really appeal to me. I'm a huge fan of this card and this design, and it's a shame that I haven't played decks where it's made the cut yet.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely a tech villainy option. Especially in the villainy decks that run a lot of self mill, because a huge part of the value of this deck of this card rather is hitting it off of a dredge effect and then just having a wrath that will, as you said, loom over your opponent's head. Sure, like maybe sacking a villainy isn't the greatest thing ever, but if you're also wiping the board and making a 3/3 or 4/4, like sometimes that is a play that your opponent will have to respect. And being able to change how your opponent plays drastically without even playing the card, like if you just mill it or discard it with something like a torment land, like that is a ton of value for your sweeper to have, especially when your sweeper also just costs 4 mana.
I do think this card has place in things other than villainy, especially for making the assumption that you're not trying to play this exactly on 4 and exactly then like on 5.
Yeah.
Because if you have a little bit more flexibility, play you can play this in like a green black deck, or maybe even a green, maybe even like an Abzan deck. Something
Yeah,
like
I
Heart
think
Attack
the
or
triple
Hunter's
black is a
Hideout.
little sketchy sometimes, but like
I mean, it's
if
just
your
a
deck is
question of
base
math.
black, then yeah,
It's just a question of math, right? It's if
I
you
agree.
have how many? What's the Karsten number? It's like 20 something. It's
That sounds
low
about right.
20.
Yeah.
The
I mean, triple black
number.
on a 4 drop is not as bad as triple black on a 3 drop. Obviously, it's just
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
yeah,
And like our format's mana base eminently supports it.
If you're trying to cast it on 5, you need 21 sources, which sounds like a lot, but if you're running like 26, 27 lands, like a lot of these control decks sometimes are, you're running Intrepids, you're running black duels and fetches. I don't I don't think this is a hard thing to play to. Like I think the biggest issue this card has is the fact it's competing with some really good other sweepers. Like you are most likely you generally only have one slot for a sweeper in your main deck, and most decks are going to either want to play the more flexible Singularities Grasp or the cheaper like Sheldarin's Rage / Violent Collapse or the Mana Drain power that comes with Vibrant Rapture. But if we start seeing certain types of creature decks pop up more and more, if people are playing larger creatures that wouldn't die to these kind of smaller size sweepers, this card just triples in stock.
Which I think is likely to happen, both because of the aforementioned Vibrant Rapture being reasonably played, but also because of Pitwalt being one of the most played cards in the format. I think both of those naturally push people to like play play larger creatures. So I think that Afterlife Takes Its Due will kind of find its place in the meta, if not like basically now, then very soon.
yeah. It's definitely a card that could be the best sweeper in a certain meta.
Yeah.
Okay, next up we have Dead Set
That's a
Duo,
go. Yeah.
which is for 1 black, you get a 2/2, which can't block. Um, this is already a good aggressive stat line, but MSEM already has Depart Evangel, Shadowban Console. What makes this one great? Well, whenever it deals combat damage, you can play black and sacrifice it, and then just mind rot your opponent. And it's like, oh, okay, now we're talking.
One of the things
Yeah.
that to me is so huge about this card is it's optional. Like you can just keep saying, "Nah, I would rather have the 2/2. I would rather have the 2/2," until your opponent is in a state or you're in a board state where you say, "Cool, now I'll take the mind draw." And depending on how your opponent's playing, especially if they're forced to trade a bunch of resources, you can start to get closer and closer to sniping the best cards in their hand just by virtue of them having fewer and fewer kind of cards as buffer. Um, I think versus a lot of control decks, you want to just trade this in immediately because getting the 2-for-1 value is better than it getting, hit by an Exeunt. But it's a it's a very solid card.
Yeah, I mean, something that if you've ever played Core Set Limited, sometimes Mind Rot cast on turn 5 is a lot better than Mind Rot cast on turn 3. And in a similar way, like being able to delay the Mind Rot effect until after maybe you've beaten them in like 2-3 times with this means you're getting pretty close to Blightning territory, especially and you've only spent 2 mana. I definitely think that like it's honestly kind of insane that this card isn't played more. I think just probably because the archetypes it fits in aren't played very much, and I also think that it doesn't line up great against a lot of removal that control decks might run. But in general, I just feel like this card is individually really, really cool and also very, very powerful. Also, it one more thing, it is great to recur if your aggro deck has like cheap ways to recur like 1 CMC creatures or something like that. Like this is something that I would look at for sure.
Ketsueki is the first thing that kind of immediately jumps to mind.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but we
Leaf
certainly have
Prince.
other options.
I think we
Yeah,
talked about Shinrei, but Shinrei, I think you rather run a Girion
that's another great.
Pickpocket.
Yeah. I actually don't know if I agree with that. I think that the fact that this sacks itself, and also you can cast it for only 1 mana, plus it hits in harder. I actually would rather have this than Pickpocket in a Shinrei deck.
The difference
Granted,
the
like
difference is
it doesn't work as
is
well with.
yeah, the problem
To,
with Shinrei is that you want to sack it beforehand and then swing in and
Mhm.
hit with Shinrei. while with this card actually wants to hit in itself, so Gary and Pickpocket works better.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
also true.
and the other thing is like if you're a Shinrei deck, you're also a Suzume deck, and Suzume obviously has more synergy with Gary and Pickpocket than Dead Set Duo does.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay. Uh, next card.
Yep.
All
So
right,
moving on.
Oh wait, do we want to stay on Detsudu?
Nope, we're
no,
moving
let's
to
go to
Deadwood
Dead
Terror.
Terror.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
Pick,
so
take it
can't.
away.
you can't what?
I totally forgot this card existed since the last time we talked, despite how deep we got with this.
Yeah, this card is really cool, I think. So Deadwood Terror is a 2 mana 2/2 Death Touch in black. When it enters the battlefield from a graveyard, you make 2 tokens that are copies of it. And then you can pay 6 mana and sacrifice a creature to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield as a sorcery. In general, I think that this card, you don't want to be. Your plan should not be to activate the ability because 6 mana is a lot. But I think that given how many ways there are to recur cheap creatures with stuff like Persevere, even cards like Scion of Desolation that are already good, I think there's definitely a deck to be explored here. Um, and I feel like you can make some neat strategies that also happen to incorporate the Deadwood Terror.
It's a little bit awkward that if you're, copying this from your graveyard or you're casting it from your graveyard, it doesn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like if Chigao was ever unbanned, this card and Chigao don't actually work great together.
Yeah.
But we we have enough cheap recursion spells that I don't think that's particularly an issue. And one things we discussed last time is a 2/2 Death Touch for 2. It's not the most nuts thing ever, but that can trade up. That can block cheap creatures. This could be a lot worse.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think even if you are just playing this as a 2 drop, it's not the most embarrassing thing in creature matchups, because Death Touch does affect a lot about how your opponent can attack into you, and it can also attack into pretty much anything. Um, so I think overall this is the kind of card that it doesn't make me want to build around it per se, but it makes me look for strategies where it can fit in because like there are definitely some very neat like 2 card combos you can do with this card as
Yeah, I
well
will
as
continue to shield
yeah.
Persevere, just because I feel like I think I mentioned this, but like now that I'm aware of Persevere, I see like quote unquote combos with it everywhere. I'm like that works well with Persevere. This works well with Persevere. It's just
Yeah,
like
I mean, if we ever get something else like Unearth or something like that, just higher density of persevere like effects. I also think this card's value goes up a
yeah,
lot.
I think Unearthed, just literal Unearthed, is in Alara, which is one of the
Yeah.
potential sets for
Hmm.
next month. Okay.
Cool.
Ambitious Necromancer can do some really stupid things with this.
Oh,
That's
that
a
is
good one.
also true. So yeah,
Um,
those are some sick synergies.
one one thing I would be a little bit careful of though is if you're playing this card and your opponent mementos a descend on the helpless, it's not going to end well for you.
Oh, oh yeah, that's a bad time.
That is true. What if you're playing your own Descendant Helpless though?
Now we have
Big
value. Now we're
brain.
cooking with value.
That is wait, ooh yeah. Now we're getting
I like
somewhere.
playing good cards that enable my decent cards. That's all I want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, the next card is False God's Downfall. So 1 black sorcery, exile target creature or planeswalker. Then for each counter on that permanent, you may put a counter of that kind on a permanent you control. So okay, sorcery speed heroes downfalls are really really hard sell.
Mhm.
I don't really like playing heroes downfall in this format, and we have that, and it's instant speed. For a while, one and done was very playable in this format, but I'm pretty sure those days are past. But this card has a very unique upside, which is the fact that if you can kill a planeswalker when you have a planeswalker, you probably get to ultimate your planeswalker on the spot. And that's
Mhm.
that's really good. Um, this card is pretty game breaking versus other control decks if you're in a control deck. And sometimes randomly hose aggro decks that have creatures that like grow and get counters on them. Basically say, cool, kill your creature, put like 3+ and +1 counters on my 1/1 blocker. Now it can just eat all of your creatures. It having exile is a nice little upside. I I don't think this card is like the actual Stone Cold Nuts, but I think it's a very good tech option and something you really need to keep in your mind somewhere.
So this feels to me like in a meta where Planeswalker Villainy is the best deck, this card is a house. Because it should absolutely trounce those mirrors.
Yeah.
Um, but besides that specific world, I'm not super keen on it. I think that there are just so many good removal options in black that you never need to go for this.
Yeah, like this is like very like specific in nature, but like even within its niche, I feel like um, I personally would prefer Banish a lot of the time, unless I'm really heavy on the walkers myself. But yeah,
I think I think Banish is, how do I phrase this? Banish is very good against some specific decks, but memory side effects are one of those things that Magic players always overrate. And if your opponent has diversified their Planeswalker threat base, which basically all of our control decks do because we have so many good Planeswalkers and people just want to play all of them, even if it means cutting some of their other good Planeswalkers, your Banish is not actually that likely to really screw your opponent over. Like the board wipe mode versus tokens is obviously nice. Like I think Banish has like a much better fail case than this card, but I don't think its kind of middle ground case is actually that much better.
I think if you have a planeswalker, like if you're fairly comfortable of always having a planeswalker to like put counters on, then yeah, sure. Um, Otherwise, like I feel like Banish is just this, but with a slight upside in the middle ground case. Is just the way I'm conceptualizing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fair. All right, so the next card is Men in Pack, which is 1 black for a 1/1 flash. When ETBs, each opponent loses 1 life. When it dies, each opponent discards a card. This card is just kind of genuinely okay. So there's a very specific time for this card, and that specific time is with Agonizing Punishment. Um,
I
I am
remember
someone
you
who is
mentioned
down.
last time we talked about this. Um, I hate this card because it makes a card that I think is bad play good.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where Agonizing Punishment is still at the end of the day it costs you 2 cards, it costs you 3 mana, and you're taking up to 3 cards from your opponent. And that's not actually that nuts of a rate, especially when your opponent can pay life to avoid it. But Men in Pack just adds that one additional, oh, it's not actually costing me 2 cards, because I'm getting that automatic 1 card parity off of Men in Pack's death trigger. Um, but the fact that Men in Pack is, a dies trigger and not a leaves the battlefield vastly reduces its abuse cases, which good. One thing that we didn't talk about last time is this is a goblin. So if we ever have like a kind of goblin tribal deck and it's already in black for whatever reason, this is probably something you want to bring in versus control decks because if you play a couple of these guys, their board wipe starts looking much worse.
Yeah. This card in general just feels like a great filler piece for lots of archetypes because it kind of does a lot of different things at once. And like it's never going to be a card that you're like super excited about putting in your deck, but sometimes your deck just needs this effect.
Yeah, I think it comes down to like it's in a weird place because it's a black one drop. Usually you want to be aggressive with those, but we have probably at this point maybe 5 or 6 better aggressive one drops. So you really again like you really have to be getting something out of it down. Like you really have to be using all parts of it. I feel like despite it being flexible, you can't just put it in someplace where like one part of it matters.
Yeah, one thing I like about MSEM is that I think there are a lot of cards that are playable, but only if your deck is making them playable. Um, and it's just kind of about recognizing, okay, like what is the situation where this niche card is actually better than the mainly played version. You know what I mean by that?
Mm,
I feel like that's something that's true in MSEM a lot more than it is in Canon Magic, just from my experience.
that's fair.
Cool. Should we
Um,
go to the next card?
Yep.
sounds good to me.
And I think with this
All right.
first one, we're moving into red with Left on the Wayside, which is 1 and a red for a modal spell, which allows you to either destroy target artifact or add triple red.
So I was the one that pitched it. I think I think this card is good in a pretty specific circumstance, which is if you're playing a combo deck that uses rituals. We already have plenty of good 2 mana plus 2 mana gain 3 mana rituals. And a lot of them are much better than this in that they have higher potential upsides or mana fix. So you're not main decking this. Where this card is good is specifically the fact that if there are artifacts that stop you from winning the game, like if Potion of Inhibition or Titan Snare or something like that just totally blows you out, you can
Mm-hmm.
board this in and you can increase your answer density to those types of effects without decreasing your ritual density. Because one thing that especially newer combo players really struggle with is boarding the right number of cards because you're always skirting that line of you never want to be cold because you said, I don't need a board in the Chain of Vapor. And they played, a Sigil of Radiance or something. But on the other hand, if you board in too many things, you just totally deny your ability to go off, and you're now this like bad control deck that has no win cons.
Yeah, I think the best modal cards are usually cards that have one mode you really want to use, or at least one mode you really want to use, and then another mode that you do want in your deck, but you don't want to devote a specific slot to. And this fits that description perfectly.
Yeah, 100%.
Sorry to interrupt, Caillou. I think there may be something on your end, like a creaky chair or something, that's causing some additional noise.
There is. I'm
Uh,
muting my mic during it, so don't
okay,
worry.
cool.
They,
Yeah.
I'm just uncomfortably sitting in this chair and waiting for y'all to talk. So
Got
let me have my
it.
let me have my creaky chair.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure you were aware.
Got you. Got
Sorry,
you.
sorry to interrupt. Okay.
Okay.
Should we do next one?
Yep. Next one is Rabid Thrill, which is 1 and a red for an enchantment. It's just a very powerful anthem. Creatures you control get +2/+0. However, whenever a creature you control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to you. So very much all or nothing. Of course, it works best in tokens aggro, but tokens aggro is kind of just not very favorable right now because of Vibrant Rapture, as we mentioned earlier. So it's kind of just like a toss-up, is how I feel about it. Like, it's very good
Yeah.
in this specific archetype, but that archetype is not very good right now.
The other thing of note is this card. So we were just talking about how aggro has some issues with, or token-based aggro decks have issues with control. This card also gives you a weakness to mid-range / aggro decks because this makes it so much worse when your opponent has blockers. The second you start taking damage from that second ability, this card starts looking a little bit bleak, which isn't even to account for the times where your opponent goes, okay, I didn't have Vibrant Rapture, but I did have this 3 damage to all creatures board wipe. And you're like, oh, that does me 15 damage.
Yeah, I think that this card is the kind of thing you would run in a very, very all-in, almost combo-like tokens deck, because once you play this, it's pretty much like, okay, I'm gonna kill you in 2 turns, or I probably lose the game.
The other thing of note is, and one of the things I think is really powerful about this card, is it gives aggro and token decks in particular so much game versus combo. The way this just vastly jumps up your damage output sometimes can just allow you to just outlane your combo decks. Like if you go turn 1, here's my 1-drop token maker, into turn 2, Rabbit Thrill, swing for 3, turn 3, Sigura Tom, swing for 12.
Yeah.
A lot of combo decks start looking at that and going, well, I have 5 life to work with. Less if I fetched. Uh, I need to win this turn or else I'm dead. What's my out? What's my line?
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much sums up my thoughts on this. I just think that, like, it is a very all or nothing card, and when it's on, it is on.
One thing is that if your opponent isn't using Shaldrin's Rage as their wipe, it also gives you like or like Flesh to Rot as their wipe. It also gives you like a reasonable chance at like rebuilding, because like instead of having like, well, I can make these 2/1/1s, but then that gives them too much time to like recover. If all of your creatures are like 3/1s, oh, it's like, oh, okay, suddenly my Dragon's Fodder puts 6 power on the board, which they immediately have to answer. That's scary. So it makes it a lot easier to like rebuild from bad situations. Yeah, I think that I can move on to the next card, which is Reason Rots Rage Remains. Pip, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this card is a little bit of a pet card for me. But this card is uniquely very, very good at doing the thing that it's doing. So it's a red X for X damage to any target. So one red on top of Blaze is not a good spell. Like straight up, Blaze is not a good constructed spell. 1 mana more than Blaze gets substantially worse. Except this has Reconstruct. So the kind of baseline is okay. Well, Blaze that you can flash back, that's damn near Devil's Play, and Devil's Play was a rather strong card. Probably one of the best Blaze variants we've ever gotten. Banefire is the only one that you can kind of argue against.
Creator's Clause?
Reconstruct. Yeah, screw Creator's Clause. That's the official take of me. Creator's Clause. Um, Reconstruct being a discount, however, completely changes the dynamic of this card. If you're some kind of mid-rangey aggressive deck and you're capable of cashing in a 4-drop into just an additional 4 damage out of nowhere, that can hugely change, your opponent thinking that they've stabilized and then they're dead. The fact it's a Blaze you can cast from a graveyard is also really relevant for some combo decks. And the thing I realized after I was describing those combo decks last time we recorded this is MSEM doesn't have any, but this card would be a slam dunk in World Gorger Dragon combo in standard, or not standard, Jesus Christ, not in standard, in canon Magic. Maybe if WotC added World Gorger Dragon combo to standard would be a lot more interesting. I'll say that. Yeah, no, I think this card is just it's not something you should put in all of your aggro decks, just like, ooh, this seems great. And I'm not sure which decks want to run this. One thing that I was thinking of is it'd be kind of sweet in ramp, like a red-green ramp style deck that can cast this for like 4 or 5 in the mid game, and the late game can like play cower and then flash this back for like another 14 damage.
Yeah,
I
so
don't
I'd
know.
actually consider this in Wonderfall for a couple reasons.
Really? Oh.
First of all, Wonderfall generates a lot of mana. And second of all, well, maybe so I would not consider this in Wonderfall once Towering Vows gets nerfed because part of the reason I would want it is because the deck runs so many fetches that you basically have access to whatever fetchable land you want. And being able to fetch Towering Vows and then
And
discard
discard it.
this, yeah,
Yeah.
is it gives it another axis of interaction. So I would only run this in the sideboard, but being able, like for instance, if you have a secret play, right, you usually end the turn with somewhere around 8 lands, and that's like on the like that's about the average. You can also end your turn with like 12 lands sometimes. So if you make that secret play, oftentimes you can just either maybe you weave the Towering Vows in there, discarded your Reason Rots, and then you just won the game because you spent like, I don't know, your 3 mana and then you sack your Seeker and you do like 6 damage, which sometimes is enough to close out the game. Or you just untap and dome your opponent twice and play it like it's Devil's Play. Either way, like I think that this card could be a decent sideboard tech option, although it gets a lot worse without Towering Vows fetchable. But also, like you said, this is a decent option for like a more traditional ramp deck.
Yeah, I like this a lot potentially in Big Red if,
Yeah.
like, because you're talking about like rampy decks that are like also reasonably aggressive slash burny. Like, I think that this can do wonders there. It works really well with Emily Main because you can minus her, ditch it to the discard, and then still flash it back later. So I'm a big fan. I'm not like a huge fan, but I think like as a 1 or 2 of there just for the reach, pretty solid.
I think the next deck building project I may tackle is actually Big Red, so we'll see how that
Ooh,
goes.
exciting! Actually, yeah, hit me up for that because Big Red has been something that I've had my eyes on for a while.
Okay.
Notably, if you discard this with Emily Main's downtick, you can immediately cash it in for 8 damage by sacrificing her.
Right. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Does Emily Main's downtick also produce mana?
Yes, it produces four red.
It produces
6 red.
Just like
it produces 6 red.
Yeah, that is a straight up huge combo.
Yeah.
That means you cast Emily and you can immediately discard Reason Rots and then cast it for essentially free, and X will be
8.
That's
what 8? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's 4 mana, 8 damage. Like honestly, that's kind of sick.
The other thing notably is your opponent doesn't have a chance to go, oh shit, because the second you discard it, you have priority again, and you can immediately reconstruct it. They can't grave hate it out from under you.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. Yeah, yeah.
All right,
Yeah.
Next up,
let's go to the next one. Who's a planeswalker? Regia, Truth Chaser. So one red red. Um, a 3-drop three loyalty planeswalker. Whenever you activate any of her abilities, you can exile a card from your hand. If you do, draw a card. +2, each player exiles up to 2 cards from their hand, then draws that many cards. 0, until end of turn, you may play a card exiled with her, and you may spend mana to cast it as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. And then -10, each player exiles all but the bottom card of their library and may play cards they own exiled this way until the end of their next turn. So she's a very hard card to evaluate. I think the usual play pattern of her is +2, then 0 basically forever. Um, since her first ability combined with her 0 is basically you get to rummage, and then you also get to play the card that you exiled, which is kind of huge. It can mean that it's either rummaging or actual straight up draw card. Um, the +2 is kind of this weird like catch your opponent in a bind because in the early game your opponent wants to ditch the late game cards, right? Because they don't have the ability to use those right now. However, it if your opponent ditches a big thing, you can then just in a couple of turns 0 grab that big thing. I think this card's nuts in EDH. This
Oh
card
yeah.
also obviously has some issues in that against combo decks, giving them card selection, especially if they're then able to just like ditch extra lands or whatever they don't care about, can probably just kill you. But I think this card's actually probably very solid.
yeah, I
I
think the way the place I was proposing it is as like a different option to Mena Al Majid as a more like survivable option, and I think that's probably the I think like the most apt comparison that I can think of.
I think I'm definitely the lowest on this card out of the three of us. I think that in terms of planeswalkers, even for red, you can do better than this. I just really dislike the idea of giving your opponent card selection at all on your planeswalker, and like, yes, your opponent like might give you a spell if your planeswalker lives, but that's also like pretty risky. I think that the only scenario where I'm happy with this is if you're almost always just zeroing it, and the only way that's usually going to happen is if you're playing this on a turn that's later than 3. Um, so like turn 4, playing this on 3 and then playing a land that you exile is good value. And if you're playing it like that, I'm a fan. But besides that, I would probably look for other options.
And before we move on, like I mentioned last time, I think one thing that I really love about Razia is that she's just a really unique design for a red walker, and I think that like just as a designer that like tickles me. I
Oh
love.
yeah, 100%, 100%. I love the design. I just am personally usually averse to playing cards that give my opponent choices.
Oh yeah, no, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure this card was originally. I'm trying to remember exactly how it was worded. But it was originally worded in such a way that the 0 was straight up. Oh, I think the 0 was. No. Sorry, I'm trying to remember exactly how it was worded. I know this used to be a 3-drop that effectively had 0 mana draw card. Um, and I was like, that's kind of nuts. This card's great. And then it got changed slightly. So now it's technically not too much worse, but it definitely is worse.
And yeah, didn't you mention? Oh yeah, we also mentioned character-wise. This is Razia's first appearance in the MSC verse. She is a planeswalker of Cajuns, I believe, who is
Correct.
pretty important in the greater MSC verse. So, I think
Yeah.
the next planeswalker we're going to see is another planeswalker who's been referenced in the MSC verse before, but is making their first appearance in MSEM as a card. It's Cower, End of Lies. Oh, 8 mana? Why are we talking about this? He's not going to be playable in MSEM. But wait, he also has a static. He costs X less to cast? Well, what's X? The number of non-land permanents your opponents control? Hold up, that's suddenly very playable. Especially in EDH. In EDH, this guy's just 2 mana. That's kind of insane. But yeah,
Yeah.
overall, this is a very powerful card. And this is before we even get to his actual abilities, which range from card advantage to removal plus card advantage. Just kind of nutty.
Yeah,
I
this thing is really, really sweet. I do think that your deck should expect to cast him for around 7 mana some amount of the time, so you do need to be a deck that's capable of casting 7 drops in order to want to run this, I think. But like in any ramp deck, I feel like this is a very, very strong consideration.
And unless your opponent is really not committing to the board, I think like you can cast this for 5 most of the time.
Yeah. The other main thing I think, and I've shared this opinion, I think people +2 cower too much. Um, because unless your deck is built such that it is basically all permanents, if you +2 cower and miss, you're not like dead, but you've now like dumped a bunch of mana. Because like let's be real, even in the nuts case scenario, if it's 2 mana, it's probably the last resource you have because you've presumably been holding on to it for a fair bit. But if you miss with it, yeah, sure, it has 8 loyalty, but that's not actually that good of a situation to be in. Um, I think cower more often than not, you should -4 first, unless your opponent literally has no relevant permanents, and just like snipe out a land, and then you get to impulse to find something, which is so much better.
Yeah, I would agree for sure. Like, I do think that you probably want to be a deck that's almost like maybe 90% permanence, just because like the +2 doing nothing is kind of rough. If you do happen to cast this for like 5 mana or more,
Hmm.
um, and if your deck is mostly permanents, oftentimes you can afford to run this out and plus it. Um, but like, yeah, it's definitely a flexible card because the situations where you want a +2 versus the situations where you want a -4 are fairly different.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I think
Um,
card good.
yeah, for
Hot,
sure.
hot take, but card good.
Damn, kind of controversial. Next up, we're gonna have another Cower card, Cower's Gift. 1 and a green for a plant. It's a 0/2, but at the beginning of your upkeep, it grows by 1 because you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Then you gain life and add green mana equal to its power. You don't lose that mana as steps, phases, and turns end. That's powerful in and of itself because you've got a threat that, if it sticks around, is not only going to ramp you, but also gain you life and become a huge threat itself. But it also does it when it dies, which means if your opponent doesn't use Exile based removal, this actually just kind of pops off. Because then their removal suddenly ramps you and also gains you a bunch of life.
Yeah, I think you really want to have other sources of either +1/+1 counters or like buffs for Cower's Gift. I think otherwise it's a little too slow. But if you are like ramping it at all, like you're putting counters on it, such as with Siege Shrine, love Siege Shrine, which is a fetchable forest that enters tapped and puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control when it enters. This card can be very dagger to handle. Like I've played against this when I was on burn, and it's kind of a nightmare sitting across the table from you. And then when you combine that with the fact that, when you untap with it the first turn, it's +1 mana, or if you have a Sea Shrine, it's +2 mana. This card can also kind of help jump you into your 5 or 6 drops, which is great.
I think this card kind of suffers from on curve syndrome, where it's like it's very, very good if you play it on turn 2, and it's rather weak if you aren't. Just because I think the reason you'd play this over other mana dorks is its ability to snowball. Um, and I think that if you are one way to kind of circumvent that is that if you are a deck um, that can put counters on your creatures, this is like a very good payoff if you also want to be generating a bunch of mana. And the fact that this also lets you gain a bunch of life and maybe get a big blocker for aggro decks is another reason why you might want it. Um, I actually think that this would be a pretty solid Wonderfall sideboard card for certain metas because, like, for instance, if you're playing against Dredge, like you can drop this on turn 2 and then hopefully it'll stymie the aggression and then eventually become a giant blocker. And you can also grow it yourself with Into the Unknown.
The synergy between this and Into the Unknown is actually pretty cool.
Yeah, the problem is just like the other 8 Mandorks that you're running are kind of like universally better than this, so you kind of have to.
Yeah, fair.
Yeah. Um,
Did you ever consider sideboarding this?
In Wonderful?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just said. I think, like, for instance, in the current meta, I think it could be a pretty solid sideboard option for Wonderfall. I am currently running Snowfield Mother in that sort of slot, but
Mhm.
I think after
Just like the
playing the
decks in
deck
this
more,
specific
yeah,
tournament seem like fast enough that like Coward's Gift might actually like because it gets to come down earlier. Because I feel like in lots of games, ironically, you don't get to 4 lands. You just kind of pop off before then, and Coward's Gift means that it can give you that like little life gain you need to get there and then pop off sometimes.
yeah. I think the problem is that, like, sometimes you need to stall out the game, and you're really relying on drawing cards like over a longer pace of the game if you are playing that plan versus dredge. And like Snowfield Mother is going to be a lot more consistent in what it provides you, whereas Coward's Gift is like if you need like to draw your life gain card to survive and then you draw Coward's Gift, it's not actually going to save you. That's
Entirely
the other
fair. Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, that's
And you
fair.
do have to slow down your early plays in order to play this. Like if I play a turn 2 Coward's Gift, I can't play a turn 2 Splitting Blue.
Hmm. Which I think is kind of going to be a symptom of playing against Dredge in general. But yeah,
Yeah.
Against other aggressive decks, Splitting Bloom is great. Just being a 0/3 is very powerful.
Splitting Bloom is the best card against Dredge. It totally blocks up the board. If you have a Splitting Bloom that lasts for like a couple turns, the only way you lose to Dredge is by the token, the demon token.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can't lose.
Yeah, that's definitely a weakness of Dredge, just
Yeah.
being too ground bound.
Like
Okay.
I've had games where my opponent had 3 Embradu Goliaths, and I just chump blocked them with Saplings for the entire game.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit off track, so let's move on
Yeah,
to the
sorry,
next
sorry.
card. Logger
Yeah.
Recluse, which is also a good defensive body in its own right. 1 mana, 0/3, and it has the Arboreal Grazer text. When it enters the battlefield, you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. However, you can also pay 2 mana to give it +3/+0 until end of turn, which is just like really good when your like mana dork is also like a powerful aggressive beater. So no slouch. I've definitely seen it, and I've seen this in like a lot of decks which also care about like the reusing the ETB for some reason, especially if they're like drawing cards. Having a mana dork which also gives you more dividends is sometimes just very strong.
Yeah, I think this fits very, very well into a lot of different decks for different reasons. Like for example, it's great in Blue's Featherfall deck because it provides a creature onto the board that can attack reasonably well by itself and also helps ramp you into your combo. Um, I think I could see this in many different like landfall-ish aggro decks. It's also just like a solid like ramp creature. It blocks well. It gives you something to do with your early mana if you're not ramping. And given that you're probably going to be producing a lot of mana, like this is pretty close to a 1 mana 3/3 in the late game. So yeah, overall, I just think that this is a very solid card that should see play in a variety of different decks.
I think this card's probably better than Arboreal Grazer, which is really saying something given how much Arboreal Grazer influences. I think the
Yeah.
only thing kind of holding this card back is the fact we have so many nuts 1-drop mana dorks, and the fact that unlike other mana dorks, this isn't card advantage. Like, the classic example of if you have a hand that's 1 forest and 2 Llanowar elves, you can cast 3 drops. If you have a hand that's 1 forest and 2 Logger Recluses, you can cast 1 drops. So that's not great. But for any deck that's trying to specifically hit various land thresholds, this is fantastic. And the fact that this can be swinging as a 3/3 kind of makes it a pain for control decks because control decks usually want to like let you stick your mana dork and then handle the scary stuff. And in this case, the mana dork is the scary stuff.
Yeah, agreed.
Yep. Okay, moving on. The next card we have is a Refuse Trawler. You want to take this one, Dodger?
Yeah, sure. So Refuse Trawler is a 2 mana 1/3 in green. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay green. If you do, choose one. And the 2 options are return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, or rediscover a permanent card. And just to go over what that does, because I think this is the first rediscover effect that we've talked about. It's you look at the top card of your library, and then you can reveal it and put it into your hand if it's a permanent card. Otherwise, you can put it back or put it into your graveyard. So where this card is a very interesting combination of abilities that kind of makes it a a Merfolk Branchwalker / Eternal Witness hybrid, both of which are very good cards. The main caveat for both of those effects is that it costs 3 for the Branchwalker side, and then you also can only return permanents. But the reason I really like this card is because it's very flexible. Oftentimes, you just want to return permanents anyway in green decks, and having your Eternal Witness be a solid turn 3 play to maybe like hit another card and get some card selection is a lot of flexibility that Eternal Witness doesn't usually have when you are playing with it. Plus, speaking of flexibility, being able to play this as a 2-drop, to like maybe you just want a body on turn 2 to block aggro decks, like that is also a very solid mode. And overall, I just think this is a very interesting card that I am surprised that I haven't really seen played that much before. And I would love to include it in whatever deck I build next if it fits.
Yeah, the one deck I've seen it in so far is CFE Sucks 5-color Monument deck, which use it to good effect to either like rebuy a Granny or a Monument that was destroyed, or you can just kind of use it for card draw, and then you can just kind of loop. You're obviously, because the whole deck runs on like a ETB looping engine, you can just start looping it and then drawing cards off of it. Mm-hmm. You got any thoughts, Pip?
Not particularly. I think this card's very solid. The one thing I would note is it's better than Branchwalker in the sense that one of the downsides of Explore creatures is the fact they don't actually provide. You're never drawing a real card with them. You're just drawing a land. Whereas this can absolutely just be straight up a draw card if you built your deck correctly.
Yeah,
But,
very true.
Yep.
It is 3 mana committed Branchwalker though, so that's worth pointing out. But yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
So the first multicolored card is a fucking doozy. Resigned to Madness is 3 blue and black. Sorcery. Each player mills half their library rounded up. Then return a creature card from a graveyard to the battlefield under your control. So like traumatized, but it hits every single person for the same exact cost, and then you get to steal a card out of graveyards. Pretty good. Not bad, I will say. People have already figured out ways to make this combo kill. Like if you mill over a Herald of Wisdom and a copy of it's something.
First play on Fortress.
Thank you. I've played that card a bunch, but I kept wanting to say it had memories in its name. Anyway, you can then immediately just combo kill mill your opponent by, you've milled half your library, you pop out a creature, you free cast a thing that mills someone equal to the cards in your graveyard, and that probably kills them. Isn't necessarily a lock, but it usually will get the job done. This card is it's the fact that we've seen blue-black EDH decks and they haven't been playing this, I think is just flat out wrong. I assume it's not on people's radars. But since we were talking about broken bribery effects earlier in this recording, this card is probably the best bribery effect in the format, and might be one of the better reanimation effects if you have 5 mana to spare. Like, Shadows of Alduin has seen GP play, and that thing's one advantage is the fact it can cast Tyrant Topplers, but also the disadvantage is, it's casting them so they can counter them. But Resigned to Madness is just this kind of one and done. It's largely immune to the types of graveyard hate people pack. Like, you can't Cold Grave this, you can't Memento Mori this, you can't Seal the Tomb this, because it flips the creature into the graveyard and then into play in the same turn. And if you don't hit anything exciting and your opponent does, great, you can grab their thing instead.
Yeah. Hard to agree with everything you said.
Pretty much. I think that's just about all of the cool benefits of running this card. Like, when you have an enabler that also dodges hate all in one, kind of not bad. So next up, we're going to talk about Machias Marked Marauder. 2 red and a black for a hasty 3/3 boy who allows you to sacrifice a creature, discard a card, reappropriate, or pay 2 life to give him +1/+0 until end of turn. So I think Pip was the one who was kind of doing the math on this and being like, this is crazy, so I'm going to let her talk about it.
Yeah, so, okay, some, real quick math. If you have 4 cards in hand, Those 4 cards represent +6/+0 for Machias. So that's 9 power already. That means that if you pay, let's say your opponent has taken a couple damage from their fetch lands. Let's say they're at 16. Coincidentally, as long as you pay, so it has 9 power, you need to get a +7. You pay 14 life, they're dead. This has haste, which automatically helps enable it a bunch. You're putting cards in your graveyard anyway because of your fetch lands, because of cantrips, those sorts of things. Machias just kind of comes out of nowhere and just immediately kills someone with that shotgun. And I think this card is a really funny EDH commander that probably makes a lot of people very angry because you just kill people out of nowhere with commander damage. You can pay 18, or sorry, if you pay 36 life, go down to 4 life, this immediately does 21 commander damage. And yeah, you're at 4 life, but you also just one-shotted someone. And if you gave it lifelink, you're in a really good spot. I also love this card because it is, to my knowledge, the only custom Magic card I have ever seen with fuck in its flavor text, and the flavor text in general is really good.
Yeah, I think we've kind of been glossing over for time just like the names and the flavor text of these cards, but they are all stellar. So I encourage you to, if you're kind of like enjoying them as we're going along, go through the whole set. It slaps. It's great.
Yeah, strong agree. Traveling the Hell Wastes is our other red-black card that's particularly exciting. So 1 red-black, it's enchantment. ETB, you get a 1/1 scout that gains haste until end of turn. And then whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 2 life. If you do, draw a card. So this is a card it's 2 kind of small effects stapled together, but I think it is just efficient enough that I think it should be seeing a little bit more play. Obviously, paying a bunch of life kind of hurts. You don't want to do that too often. But if you're an aggro deck against a control deck, your life total doesn't super matter. And making all of your creatures cantrip, making Sigura's Tom +1 draw you 3 cards, that's great. And the fact that the card's kind of fail case is a 2-for-1, because you play it, you get a token, you pay 2 life, you draw a card. The token has haste in. If opponent untaps, then Pith Wilts this. You still have the token and it replaced itself with like a real card. So I don't know. I think this card is like just neat in a bunch of little ways. And I'd be curious to see people like experiment with it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, everyone knows that I like my my engine enchantments. And I think that this card honestly feels like the black red Into the Unknown. In a weird way, it even also makes scouts, which is kind of uncanny. I do think that like being able to draw cards for 0 mana is really really powerful, and if you can cast this on curve, being able to draw something like 4 cards in a game with this in black red is something that you don't usually get to do that much. So I would be interested in having a deck that could maybe have a bunch of ways to gain the life you're paying back, so you can draw more cards. And I think you can definitely fuel some kind of engine that way. That would be what I would look to do with this. I think if you're playing this fairly, you probably have better options for card draw though. Given
Why don't Soul Sisters decks splash black to play this? Because then they also get access to Pithwill.
that seems great to me. I think that would be the first place I'd start, because if you're doing Soul Warden shenanigans, like the life you're paying is pretty much negligible. And we all know that white struggles for card draw, so this could be a great fix.
Yeah, like playing this alongside what was the 2 mana creature that whenever you gain life for the first time each turn you make a cleric. Like
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go for that. That seems great.
Mm-hmm. And like
There
unlike,
also may be a way to go
this
infinite
is,
with this, but I'm not
That's
sure
to
what
be
that is.
discovered another day.
mm-hmm. A little bit too big brained. Okay. Yeah, I think
Okay,
if this was 2 mana, like Into the Unknown and Paired Pools, it would just be the nuts. As it is, it's kind of in like a middle ground space where it's very strong, but also 3 mana is a lot of mana.
Right. This is a correctly costed card. It is costed such that it doesn't break things, which unfortunately means you need to put in a little bit more effort to justify playing it, because usually you err on the side of playing broken things. So the next card is a card I put on this list for one specific interaction, and we can just get it over with. This next card has a first ability that doesn't super matter, and it also has just tap it, remove a counter from a permanent you control, draw a card. So where I want to play this card is in a really bad bug endless discoveries deck, because this can continue to keep your endless discoveries counters down while still drawing you extra cards. Soul Diviner was not the worst card ever in its standard. This card's basically Soul Diviner, but in a different color combination. Um, Ignore the fact that this is not standard.
No,
I rest
totally. That's what it stands for. MSEM, Magic Standard Editor Modern, obviously.
True.
I think it's Magic Standard Editor Maker, you will find.
Oh yeah, true. Okay, next up we have Approach of Old Lovi, which is 3 red and a white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you put a counter on it, and then it deals X damage to any target, and you gain that much life. So basically, it's just kind of...
Yeah, you say your thing.
I was just saying, it basically just is a win con that like doubles its removal and grows and helps you stabilize. The problem is it's slow and has very little immediate board impact.
Yeah, this is a card that in the older days of MSEM, if this set had been in like the first 2 or 3 waves, this card would have felt like not the worst to cast and would have felt really cool when you get it off the ground. And I still think it's probably cool if you're enabling it somehow. I'm not sure what that entails. I don't know if we have anything that doubles end steps. That'd be great with this. Proliferation also
Wait,
okay
didn't
with
you
this.
literally print a card that doubles end steps?
Yes, I did. I totally forgot that. That was an Archon in my defense. Um,
I was like, hold up.
okay, so yeah, that's a synergy you could use, I guess. I would not recommend it, even though that's my card, but that is a thing you could do. And I do feel like if this card gets 3 triggers off, most kind of aggressively slanted decks can't really beat you at this point because you've gained 6 life and probably killed 2 of their creatures. So all you need to do to beat aggro decks is play your 5-drop and then survive for another 2 turns. It's so easy.
Yeah, this feels like where I would look to run it is like a niche sideboard finisher in Legend Weaving. Besides that, I'm a little unsure because paying 5 mana to get this enchantment on the board and then waiting like 2 or 3 more turns before it starts actually returning on the mana investment is kind of a hard sell for me.
Yeah, I would just play Flare Blitz and be done with it.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, next up we have Risky Salvager. I think, Dodger, it was you who put this on the list?
It was not, but I can talk about it.
Oh, okay. Wait, was it? Then it must have been Pip, right?
Well, maybe, yeah. I mean, so Risky Salvager is a red and a white for a 2/2. It makes all your artifacts and enchantments cost 1 less, and then whenever it attacks, you get to rediscover an artifact or enchantment card. That's a pretty solid combination of abilities. Particularly the cost reduction, I think, is pretty important. There are decks in this format that want to just like storm off with a bunch of artifacts. And I mean, maybe if you're some kind of red white enchantress deck, you could try to do that too. But in general, like I think 2-drops that reduce the cost of a certain type of spell are always worth looking at. And the fact that this one actually also lets you draw cards too is another pretty interesting thing. I think this card is probably doesn't get there right now, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I think it's just it lines up a little bit awkwardly into the Hellbent speeds as they currently are built.
Yeah.
But I really like the kind of core design of it's a discount thing, so it can kind of help you combo off. But also in the gameplay where in the turns of the game where your opponent has like stopped what you've done and you fizzled, if you play this, you can start grinding them out, especially control decks, especially post board, where they've presumably gotten rid of all their removal, and then you bring this thing in, and it's like, okay, well, this thing's gonna potentially draw cards, pressure my planeswalkers, filter their draws, and also is discounting things at the same time. Whoops.
Yeah, it's also like I love like I feel like the artifact and enchantment batching is one that I have rarely seen, but like it feels it's like, yeah, they're both the odd like permanent stepchildren. It makes sense. And I think that's our last multicolored card, if I remember right. Yep, we're moving on to Cobble Transport. It's 3 for a 4/4 trample haste, but it's a vehicle, so you have to tap 3 untapped artifacts and creatures you control. So far, the one place that this has seen play is in Crazy Train, which is essentially an artifact storm deck, which then basically generates a bunch of artifact tokens which you can crew this with, and then it swings in for lethal. I'm not even convinced that this is the best win con for that deck, but it is the current win con of that deck, and in that deck it has been functioning reasonably well. Which
it kind of is the kind of card that you probably will only see in that deck, in that specific deck, just because it is pretty narrow. But you know, like if you're some kind of artifact token aggro deck, like this is a way to go over the top of blockers. But I don't really know if like
probably still play
that's the best payoff. Yeah.
Okay. Next up is Head of Ulko, which is 8 mana. At the beginning of your end step, exile target permanent, and when it leaves the battlefield, you return all cards exiled with it to the battlefield under your control. So, it's just...
So this
Yeah, go
card
ahead.
I put on because I played it first in an EDH deck where it felt really neat, even though I never got to do it. Because if you Relic Heist for this, Relic Heist becomes a 4-mana mind control, except it can hit any permanent, and it's forever. And then Ruben pointed out that you can have it exile itself, which means if you Relic Heist for this, you can, at the beginning of your end step, exile itself, and then it'll enter the battlefield under your control. And
So
this time it
it's
won't
just
go
4
away
mana.
at the next end step.
Yeah, just 4 mana
So-
tutor for it, keep it forever.
Yeah, so you can choose, okay, I can either 4 mana gain control of the best permanent on the board, or I can 4 mana, basically at the start of my next upkeep, I now have a Head of Ulko. This card's kind of weird because, Repeated Vindicate, pretty good. But the place where it's best is in EDH, and it's only on your end step, and you have 3 people who really want to fuck it up. The good news is if your opponents break it, you get all the things out of it. So at some point, they kind of end up in this weird sunk cost fallacy state where they're like, well, we can't afford to remove the Head of Ulko because if we do, that person gets like 3 or 4 of the best permanents over the past few turns, just all at once. But I don't know. I think this card is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, given that you can also target itself, you can just decide to get the stuff whenever you want.
Oh,
and
true.
it'll also return itself, so it essentially costs you nothing to do that.
Well, it costs you a Vindicate. It
Yeah,
means
it costs you a Vindicate, but like you take those, it's fine. I think that given the Relic Heist interaction, this is absolutely worth a slot in the whatchamacallit,
11th hour breakthrough combo.
the reinvent deck. Yeah, over Spectral Skycruiser, this feels like almost always just better. Yeah, it costs 1 more mana, but if you're Relic Heisting this has got to be better than Spectral Skycruiser.
This is definitely better if you're Relic Heisting it. I think it is on average worse if you're reinventing, because this can't be found by reinvent. Spectral Skycruiser can. And I think that's nice about reinvent is you frequently end up then with a bunch of mana left over that you can start using the Spectral Skycruiser.
That is true. Fair point.
But I also, the Spectral Skycruiser is one of those cards that I want that out of the deck because I think it's really mediocre there. And this would be the best excuse that I think you can find.
Yeah, I also agree that Skycruiser is sort of bad in that deck.
Yeah. And this card just slaps. So, if you want to have fun, then you play this. Like who doesn't want to ramp? Who doesn't want to ramp onto this ramp into Relic Heist on turn 3, play this, and start eating your opponent's lands? Fun.
That sounds very fun for both players.
I think you can technically do that on turn 2, by the way.
Oh lord.
You need to have turn 1 Galvin Coal Line.
And then
you need to have 2 Galvin Coal Lines. But if you do, you need 2 Galvin Coal Lines. But if you do, what you do is you do turn 1, you have a Galvin Coal Line and tapped. Turn 2, you play an untapped land. You tap these 2 for red and 1 other mana. You bounce the tapped land for a tapped Galvin Coal Line. You cast 11th Hour Breakthrough. You untap the 2 Galvin Coal Lines. You float 5 mana, 2 which is red. Relic Heist.
Yep. Oh, beautiful. Mwah.
And hey, fun fact: if you wanted to steal a permanent for some reason, never forget that you can always sacrifice the thing you Relic Heist for to 11th Hour Breakthrough in order to keep one of the power cells.
Oh, nice.
Pro tips.
Okay,
All right.
so our next card is Realm Tiller, which is a 2 mana rock, but you can reappropriate to add 1 mana of any color. So I don't think that this is a very MSEM playable card, but in MSEDH, if you're like a very color heavy deck and you are milling yourself anyways, then yeah, sometimes just 2 mana perfect fixing is a reasonable add in a 100 card singleton format.
Yeah, I think this is probably in the top 5 mana rocks for EDH. Like I would say it's better than Iron Signet actually.
That's a
So
little bit of a hard sell, but I could see it.
I mean, now given the state of Iron Signet, I don't think that's actually that hard of a sell. Like, Prismatic Lens is not a very powerful mana roll.
Mm-hmm. Oh, did Iron Signet get big nerfed? And when I wasn't looking, that's probably the case.
Iron Signet is now just Prismatic Lens.
Then Iron
Yeah,
Signet. Okay, then Iron Signet is not as I remember it. Rest in peace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pre the May Madness patch, for those of you who haven't been following the format for literally forever, Iron Signet used to just be sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color, which meant on turn 3 you could hit 4 mana, which turns out to break a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which makes sense why it was nerfed. I feel like
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things where I haven't seen it in a while. And so I
Turns
just did not remember.
5 mana.
Mhm. So the last card we're going to talk about is also the only land. It's Memorial Ground, which is a colorless land which enters tapped, but you can pay for and tap it, sacrifice it, and return any card from your graveyard to your hand.
So I think this card is very obviously not a good card, but it is a unique card, and that's why I wanted to put it on this list. This is the sort of card that when people are cobbling together really dumb EDH combos, this ends up in their deck because they need some way to turn Sylvan Scrying into a regrowth, and specifically a regrowth for the Planeswalker that they used to combo off or something. I think this card is just like, it's very. I'm not going to say it's very good at doing the thing that it does because it's incredibly expensive. 4 mana plus tapping it, you're effectively paying 5 mana to recur a thing. Yeah, that's not where you want to be, especially on ETB tapped land that only produces colorless mana. But it does a unique and powerful thing, and I think that's why it should be noted.
Mhm. It's probably pretty solid for EDH, I think. Generally, where regrowth effects are the most powerful.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think with that, we're done with the Lovi Awoken review. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and I think um, the lore is that this is actually our second time recording this. The first time, the footage unfortunately got corrupted, but I would like to repeat what I said at the end of the previous one, which is basically that like going over the set and looking at all these cards, it made me like feel like, oh, I've never seen that. I like and just like appreciate a lot more of what Lovey provides. And I also like just outside of like the mechanics of it, I think the lore and all of that, like I mentioned earlier, like just getting to read the flavor text and absorb that was super cool. So overall, I think like uh, I wasn't like sure what to expect when coming into to like review Lovey, but it ended up being kind of underrated in my opinion, kind of an underdog.
Yeah, I think general theme that I think a lot of these cards had is that there's a lot of hidden power, as well as just like a lot of hidden gems that maybe haven't really had their time in the spotlight yet. But I think they definitely will surface at some point when the support is there or someone figures out the right shell.
Okay, and with that, that's the end of the Lovey review. Um, Next time, we're probably going to be doing mini reviews of the sets that are coming in for the October rotation session for MSEM. So that's going to be exciting because we have a very stacked lineup. But until then, this is Caillou, Dodger, and Pipsqueak signing off.